Let me tell you something, my friends. Relations between two great nations, the United States and India, are like building muscles. It takes years of discipline, trust, and hard work to build them strong. But just like that, one wrong move, one mistake, can destroy everything, like dropping the weight on your own foot. Today, I will show you how one Indian decision, one action, brought this partnership to the edge of destruction. And just like in bodybuilding, in politics too, there are no shortcuts, no excuses, only consequences. Listen carefully. Decades of trust between the United States and India did not come overnight. It was not born in a single handshake or signed with a single treaty. It was built slowly, piece by piece, like muscle fibers torn and rebuilt stronger after every workout. For years, both nations watched each other, tested each other, and found common ground in moments when the world was filled with tension and uncertainty. Trust is not something given. It is earned through sacrifice, consistency, and the ability to stand together even when it is not convenient. That is exactly what happened with U.S.-India relations. They were not perfect, but they were forged through patience, challenges, and opportunities that made both sides realize they had more to gain together than apart. When we look back at the Cold War era, the United States and India were not natural allies. India tried to maintain non-alignment, choosing independence in its foreign policy, while the U.S. was deeply engaged in rivalry with the Soviet Union. This created suspicion and hesitation, but even during those decades, there were small signals of respect. American universities opened doors for Indian students, technology exchanges began in limited forms, and cultural ties quietly strengthened. These were like the first reps in the gym, not heavy, not impressive, but the start of something that could grow. The bond had not yet taken full shape, but it was alive. The true transformation came when the world changed in the 1990s. The Soviet Union collapsed, and India opened its economy. Suddenly, there was a new possibility. Trade, investment, and cooperation began to accelerate. The U.S. started seeing India not as a distant player, but as a rising power with democratic values and economic ambition. India started seeing the U.S. not just as a superpower, but as a partner that could help it grow and modernize. Trust began to build faster, like adding weight to the barbell after every successful lift. It was no longer just about culture or education. It was about strategy, defense, and shared goals. The nuclear deal of the 2000s was a defining moment. For decades, India's nuclear program had been a source of tension, but suddenly the U.S. chose to trust India, to see it as responsible, not reckless. That deal was not just a piece of paper, it was a symbol. It said, "We believe in your discipline, in your future, and in your ability to handle power with responsibility." This was not casual trust. It was a commitment that took years of negotiation and courage on both sides. Like building a championship body, it took sacrifice, long hours, and vision. Military exercises grew larger, joint operations increased, and intelligence sharing deepened. American companies poured investment into India's growing economy, and Indian talent filled critical roles in Silicon Valley and beyond. Families were built across borders, students became professionals, and professionals became leaders. Slowly, the relationship was not just about governments, it was about people. Every flight between New York and Delhi, every student in Boston or engineer in California, every entrepreneur in Bangalore working with an American counterpart, all of this added another layer of trust. It became a relationship of muscle memory, repeated over and over until it became strong and reliable. Of course, like in training, there were injuries and setbacks. There were disagreements on trade, on visas, on defense contracts. There were times when mistrust resurfaced, when old doubts came back into the conversation. But what made the U.S. India relationship special was the ability to recover. After every argument, there was a reason to come back to the table. After every setback, there was a reason to lift again. Both nations realized that the alternative weakness, distance, suspicion was far more costly. It was better to push through the pain and keep building. This trust extended into global challenges as well. Whether it was fighting terrorism, securing energy routes, or managing the rise of other powers, the U.S. and India found ways to align, not perfectly, not always smoothly, but with enough strength to show that the partnership mattered. The U.S. saw India as a stabilizing force in Asia, and India saw the U.S. as a partner that respected its sovereignty and potential. That understanding was not just strategy, it was trust earned through years of consistent behavior. Decades of cooperation built a reservoir of credibility that both nations could draw upon in difficult times. It was not luck and it was not charity, it was hard-earned respect. Just as a bodybuilder knows that every rep, every drop of sweat counts, the relationship was strengthened by every small act of partnership. It became clear to both sides that this was not temporary. It was the result of discipline, repetition, and the refusal to give up when things became hard. The rise of India as a U.S. ally was not an accident, nor was it something that happened in a single moment of diplomacy. It was a journey that reflected India's transformation from a cautious, inward-looking nation into a confident, outward-looking power, and America's recognition that India's rise could serve as both a stabilizing force and a strategic partner in a rapidly changing world. To understand how this happened, one must see the evolution of India's position in the global order and how the United States gradually shifted from skepticism to partnership. For decades after independence, India was committed to non-alignment. It did not want to be trapped in Cold War politics, and it pursued relationships with both Washington and Moscow in its own way. This often left the U.S. frustrated, since America expected countries to choose sides, while India insisted on walking its independent path. At times, this independence looked like resistance, especially when India leaned on the Soviet Union for defense cooperation. For the U.S., India was seen as unreliable, a country unwilling to commit fully to American interests. Yet, under the surface, India's democratic values and its potential as a huge market and regional power made it impossible for the U.S. to ignore forever. By the 1990s, the world order had changed. The Cold War ended, the Soviet Union collapsed, and India had no choice but to embrace economic liberalization. Its markets opened up, foreign investment began flowing, and suddenly India was no longer seen as just another developing country, it was viewed as a rising giant. The U.S. took notice. Here was a country with over 1 billion people, a thriving democracy, and a growing hunger for technology and trade. This was not just a strategic opportunity. It was a potential ally whose rise aligned with American interests in balancing other powers, especially in Asia. The partnership gained real momentum in the early 2000s. The United States started to see India as a counterbalance to China's growing influence. Washington realized that a strong India, with its geographic position, economic power, and democratic system, was not just another partner, it could be a cornerstone of stability in the Indo-Pacific region. For India, closer ties with the U.S. offered access to advanced technology, defense cooperation, and global recognition. It was a relationship that was not only practical but also symbolic, a handshake between the world's oldest democracy and the world's largest democracy. One of the most significant turning points came with the U.S.-India Civil Nuclear Agreement. For decades, India had been on the outside of the global nuclear order, often facing sanctions and restrictions because of its nuclear program. But the United States made the bold decision to rewrite the rules, recognizing India as a responsible power that deserved trust and cooperation. This was more than just a policy shift. It was a declaration that India was no longer a peripheral player but a central ally. The deal opened the door for energy cooperation, advanced technology exchanges, and a new level of mutual respect. The rise of India as a U.S. ally also reflected the growth of people-to-people ties. Indian students filled American universities, Indian entrepreneurs became key players in Silicon Valley, and Indian-American communities flourished across the U.S. These connections created a human bridge that strengthened the alliance beyond government policies. When leaders in Washington looked at India, they no longer saw only a foreign government. They saw millions of connections that touched education, business, science, and culture. This human element made the relationship resilient and dynamic. In defense and security, the U.S. and India began conducting joint military exercises, signing defense agreements, and sharing intelligence on critical issues such as counterterrorism and maritime security. India, once cautious about aligning too closely with any superpower, realized that the partnership gave it access to cutting-edge equipment and training, while the U.S. saw India as a reliable partner in securing vital sea lanes and regional stability. Slowly but surely, trust began to replace suspicion, and cooperation replaced hesitation. Economically, American companies poured investment into India's booming market, while Indian businesses expanded their presence in the U.S. Trade volumes increased, technology partnerships deepened, and sectors like energy, healthcare, and IT became key areas of collaboration. This economic integration reinforced the idea that both nations stood to benefit immensely by standing together. The relationship was no longer just about defense or diplomacy. It was about shared prosperity. Perhaps what made India's rise as a U.S. ally truly powerful was the shared vision of democracy and freedom. At a time when authoritarian models were spreading, both countries could point to their democratic institutions as a foundation of legitimacy. This ideological alignment gave the partnership moral weight, not just strategic value. Leaders on both sides could speak about common values, not just common interests, and that gave the relationship a deeper sense of purpose. The rise of India as a U.S. ally was also a reflection of India's own confidence. No longer was it hesitant to take its place on the global stage. It began engaging in regional leadership, participating in global climate initiatives, and shaping discussions on technology, trade, and security. The U.S. welcomed this confidence because a strong, assertive India meant a partner capable of carrying real weight in global affairs. One action, one mistake, the breaking point in any great relationship, always reveals how fragile trust can be when it is tested in the harshest way. Between two nations like the United States and India, years of patience, diplomacy, and effort created a foundation of strength. But one wrong move from one individual, one careless decision, had the power to push the relationship toward collapse. This is the dangerous reality of international partnerships. They take decades to build, but can be shaken in a single moment. For the United States, India had become a reliable ally, a partner in security, trade, and democracy. For India, the United States represented opportunity, recognition, and power in the global arena. Yet, the relationship was never immune to shocks. The bond between nations is not only shaped by strategy or treaties, but also by human actions. When one person crosses the line, when one event spirals out of control, the consequences can stretch far beyond the individual and strike at the core of bilateral trust. The breaking point came when a single action was interpreted as betrayal. In politics and diplomacy, betrayal does not always need to be dramatic. It can be subtle but devastating. It can be a statement, a deal, or an act that undermines confidence and shakes the perception of loyalty. When the United States invests trust in India, and India in return invests trust in the United States, the expectation is that neither will allow reckless behavior to put the relationship at risk. but one Indian decision made in a way that disregarded U.S. concerns changed the tone entirely. The weight of this mistake was not just about the action itself, but about what it symbolized. It told Washington that India was capable of acting unilaterally without considering the consequences. It suggested that India, despite the long years of partnership, could still put narrow interests above the shared vision of cooperation. In international affairs, symbolism matters as much as substance. A single act can signal weakness, arrogance, or even disrespect. And when such a signal is received, it is magnified by media, debated in think tanks, and dissected by political opponents. The one act became a headline, the headline became a debate, and the debate became a fracture. In India, the individual responsible for this mistake may have thought it was minor, perhaps even justified in the short term, but what they underestimated was how quickly the U.S. system reacts to perceived slights. Every move is analyzed through the lens of strategy, and this one appeared reckless. What could have been dismissed as a local issue suddenly became a bilateral crisis. American leaders, who had worked for years to bring India closer, now faced critics at home who questioned whether India could be trusted. The credibility built carefully over decades was suddenly on the line. This is how breaking points are created, not by a steady erosion, but by a sharp blow. In bodybuilding, when you overload the muscle without proper preparation, it tears, sometimes in ways that take months or years to heal. The U.S. India partnership experienced exactly that kind of strain. The one mistake became a tear in the muscle of trust, and the repair process would demand extraordinary effort from both sides. The public nature of the mistake made it worse, because when trust is broken in front of the world, it is not just about fixing the relationship in private. It becomes a matter of pride, of national image, of saving face. The ripple effects spread quickly. Diplomats scrambled to contain the damage, leaders were forced to address the issue publicly, and analysts speculated about long-term consequences. Markets, businesses, and military planners began to factor in uncertainty, wondering whether the partnership would weaken. For allies and adversaries alike, the breaking point was proof that the U.S.-India bond was not unshakable. Rivals of both nations saw opportunity while partners grew uneasy. This is why one mistake matters more than 1,000 successes, because failure is louder, sharper, and more visible. For the United States, this was not simply about disappointment, but about strategic calculation. Could Washington continue to invest heavily in a relationship if the possibility of betrayal lingered in the background? For India, it became a moment of reckoning. One action had jeopardized years of effort, and the consequences could not be brushed aside with excuses. The breaking point revealed how vulnerable even the strongest partnerships are to individual actions, and how leadership is tested not in the easy times, but in the moments when one decision threatens to undo everything. Diplomatic backlash is often more dangerous than the original mistake itself, because once the machinery of diplomacy begins to react, it carries with it the full weight of national pride, political pressure, and international image. In the case of U.S. India relations, when that single action from one Indian created a rift, the immediate and inevitable consequence was a backlash that could not be contained by silence or brushed away as a minor misunderstanding. Diplomacy works on signals, and every nation watches how the other responds. When the United States felt that its trust was violated, it was compelled to act, not only to address the specific issue, but also to send a message to allies and rivals that such behavior could not go unchallenged. The backlash did not come in the form of explosions or armies, but in the language of diplomats, statements from leaders, and the deliberate coolness of meetings that once carried warmth. Every word, every gesture became a tool of pressure. In Washington, officials debated how strongly they should respond. On one hand, the partnership with India was too valuable to destroy completely. On the other hand, to ignore the offense would be to show weakness. The result was a calculated but undeniable backlash that made India feel the weight of American discontent. Embassies became battlegrounds of rhetoric. Formal complaints were issued, summits were delayed, and official visits suddenly carried tension. American diplomats, usually careful to emphasize partnership, now stressed accountability and responsibility. The language shifted from celebration to warning. Even in public addresses, subtle changes could be felt. Words that once praised India's rise as a trusted partner now hinted at caution and disappointment. It was not just a diplomatic maneuver, it was a clear signal that the mistake had consequences. In New Delhi, the shock of the response was immediate. Indian officials understood that the U.S. was not simply posturing, it was laying down a marker. The backlash placed Indian diplomacy in a defensive position. Instead of projecting strength, India now had to explain, justify, and attempt to repair. Every move became reactive, every statement shaped by the need to contain further escalation. This is the power of backlash. It forces the accused side into a posture of damage control, stripping away confidence and initiative. The media amplified the tension. Headlines carried stories of the strained relationship, highlighting the American response and the Indian explanations. Analysts speculated about whether the partnership was collapsing. Rival nations pointed to the backlash as proof that U.S. India trust was fragile. The diplomatic pressure, which had started with a single issue, now snowballed into a public spectacle, making it harder for either side to quietly resolve the matter. Once diplomacy becomes a topic for global discussion, the stakes rise dramatically because leaders no longer speak only to each other, they speak to their citizens and to the world. The backlash also carried hidden consequences. Beyond the official statements and public gestures, there were decisions being made quietly in back rooms. Meetings that could have advanced cooperation were postponed. Sensitive negotiations were slowed down. Visas, trade talks, and defense deals all felt the chill of the diplomatic freeze. This was not an open rupture, but it was a deliberate slowing of momentum, a way of signaling that the partnership would not move forward until the issue was addressed. These small but deliberate acts are the essence of diplomatic backlash. They send a message without declaring war. For Indian officials, the difficulty was balancing national pride with the reality of needing to preserve the U.S. relationship. To apologize too quickly could look like weakness at home, but to resist the pressure could deepen the backlash abroad. Every word spoken had to be carefully measured. The breaking point had already been reached, and now the backlash was about proving who would control the narrative. Washington wanted to demonstrate that it held the upper hand, and New Delhi wanted to show it could not be bullied. The result was a tense dance of diplomacy, where each side tested the other's resolve. The greatest danger of such backlash lies in its ability to harden perceptions. Once trust is shaken, once anger is expressed, it leaves scars that are not easily healed. Even when the immediate crisis subsides, the memory of the backlash lingers in the minds of diplomats and leaders. They remember the words spoken in anger, the opportunities lost during the freeze, and the shift in tone that replaced partnership with suspicion. What began as one individual's action had now spiraled into a storm of diplomatic consequences, demonstrating how fragile the balance of international trust can be when pride and power collide. Media explosion is one of the most powerful forces in shaping how nations view each other, and when a crisis erupts between two countries, it is the media that transforms a single event into a global narrative. In the case of U.S. India relations, once the mistake was made and the diplomatic backlash began, The media became the amplifier that magnified every word, every gesture, and every speculation until the entire relationship was seen through the lens of conflict. What might have remained a contained diplomatic issue in another era became a public spectacle in a world of 24-hour news cycles, social media platforms, and instant global communication. The media thrives on stories of tension, betrayal, and drama, and this incident gave them exactly that. News outlets in the United States framed the story around the theme of trust being broken by a partner that had been carefully nurtured for decades. Headlines emphasized betrayal, questions about reliability, and speculation on whether India could be counted on as a true ally. American television panels brought in former diplomats and analysts who dissected the event from every angle, often leaning toward dramatic conclusions because those kept viewers engaged. The mistake stopped being about one individual's decision. It became a question of India's character as a nation. In India, the media reacted in its own intense way. National pride and sovereignty became the central themes of coverage. Instead of portraying the situation as an error by one individual, many outlets painted it as the United States overreacting, treating India unfairly, or trying to bully a rising power. Talk shows debated whether India should push back harder, whether the U.S. had shown its true face, and whether the partnership was really worth the effort. Public opinion was stirred by emotional appeals to nationalism, and the narrative shifted from cooperation to defiance. The same event, filtered through two different media environments, created completely opposite perceptions, each reinforcing tension rather than easing it. Social media added another layer of complexity. Unlike traditional news outlets, social platforms gave voice to millions of ordinary citizens, activists, and influencers who all contributed to the storm. Hashtags began trending on both sides, memes were created, accusations and defenses flooded timelines. The digital battlefield made the crisis feel even bigger than it was, because every opinion, whether informed or not, contributed to the escalation. Politicians could not ignore this wave of public sentiment, because in the modern age, media coverage directly influences political decision-making. International media also joined in, adding their own interpretations. Outlets in Europe, Asia, and beyond reported on the rift as if it signaled a potential collapse of one of the most important strategic partnerships of the century. Rivals of both the United States and India took advantage of the coverage, using their state-backed media to amplify divisions and highlight the fragility of the relationship. Suddenly, what began as a bilateral issue had become a global talking point, with the entire world watching and judging how both countries would respond. The media explosion also changed the tone of diplomacy itself. Leaders and diplomats no longer had the space to quietly resolve the matter behind closed doors, because every move was already being reported and analyzed in real time. If a U.S. official softened their language, it was immediately interpreted as weakness. If an Indian official stood firm, it was portrayed as defiance. The pressure of constant visibility meant that both governments had to perform for their domestic audiences while also trying to manage the crisis internationally. This dual pressure made resolution far more complicated. In this environment, perception began to matter more than reality. The actual details of the mistake became less important than the story being told about it. Media narratives painted broad pictures of betrayal, arrogance, or victimhood, and once these images were fixed in the public imagination, they were nearly impossible to erase. Even when clarifications or explanations were offered, they were drowned out by the louder voices of outrage and speculation. The truth was no longer what had happened, but what the media had declared had happened. This explosion of coverage also had practical consequences. Investors began to worry about stability, businesses paused on new ventures, and international organizations wondered whether the U.S. and India could maintain unity in multilateral forums. Media coverage fed uncertainty into the markets and into global policymaking. In both countries, leaders faced questions not just from journalists, but from their own citizens, who had been stirred into anger by what they had seen and heard. The mistake had escaped the control of diplomats and had been handed over to the court of public opinion, where emotions ruled over reason. The story became larger than life, and once it reached this stage, it could not be contained. Every newspaper, every broadcast, every tweet added another layer to the crisis, making it heavier, sharper, and more visible. The media explosion ensured that the issue would not fade quickly, because as long as it generated clicks, views, and debates, it would remain alive in the spotlight. This was the dangerous power of perception becoming reality, where the narrative itself inflicted as much damage as the original event. Economic shockwaves are among the most immediate and measurable consequences when trust between two nations begins to fracture. For the United States and India, whose partnership had grown to encompass billions in trade, technology cooperation, and cross-border investments, the impact of one mistake was not confined to diplomatic halls or television debates. It reached into boardrooms, financial markets, supply chains, and the daily calculations of businesses that rely on stability between the two countries. The global economy is built on confidence, and when confidence is shaken, the effects ripple outward in ways that are often faster and harsher than political leaders anticipate. Trade relations, which had been steadily growing for decades, suddenly found themselves under pressure. American companies that had expanded aggressively into India now questioned whether their investments would remain safe. Indian businesses that depended on access to U.S. markets wondered if tariffs, sanctions, or regulatory hurdles might follow as part of the backlash. The uncertainty itself was enough to slow momentum. Deals that were being negotiated stalled, investors hesitated to commit funds, and corporate leaders began considering alternative strategies in case the partnership deteriorated further. Even without formal restrictions, the perception of instability was enough to cost both sides money and opportunities. Technology sectors felt the tremors immediately. India had become a critical hub for IT services, outsourcing, and innovation, deeply tied to American companies in Silicon Valley and beyond. When relations soured, questions arose about whether these partnerships could continue with the same energy. Would U.S. firms still trust Indian partners with sensitive projects? Would American policymakers begin restricting the flow of technology to safeguard against potential risks? On the Indian side, there was worry about losing access to the latest innovations and investment capital that had fueled its growing tech ecosystem. The very trust that allowed information and technology to move seamlessly across borders was being challenged, and without that trust, growth slowed. The stock markets reflected the anxiety. Indian markets, sensitive to international perception, reacted with volatility as news of the crisis spread. Investors pulled back, not because the fundamentals of India's economy had changed overnight, but because confidence in the U.S. India story was shaken. The U.S. markets also noticed, particularly in sectors tied closely to India, such as pharmaceuticals, IT services, and energy. A rift between the two countries meant complications for supply chains, possible disruptions in trade, and uncertainty about future collaboration. Markets punish uncertainty, and the punishment was swift. Beyond business and finance, the economic shockwaves reached into areas that affected ordinary people. Students planning to study in the United States began to worry about whether visa policies would change. Skilled workers in the tech sector wondered if restrictions would limit their opportunities abroad. Families who relied on remittances from relatives in the U.S. felt uneasy about the stability of that flow. These concerns may not have been written into policy immediately, but the fear generated by the crisis created hesitation, and hesitation slows progress. Defense and energy sectors also felt the strain. Large contracts for military equipment, infrastructure, and energy cooperation depend on long-term trust. Any hint of instability puts billions of dollars at risk. American defense contractors looking to expand partnerships with India hesitated, knowing that political backlash could jeopardize deals. India, on its side, began to wonder whether reliance on the U.S. for advanced equipment or energy security was wise, given the unpredictability that had been exposed. These doubts weakened the momentum that had taken years to build. The shockwaves were not limited to bilateral ties. They carried into the broader global economy. Allies and partners of both nations watched carefully, wondering whether instability would spill over into multilateral forums, trade negotiations, or regional security agreements. Other countries considering investment in India became cautious, while nations competing with India for foreign capital tried to present themselves as safer alternatives. The perception that U.S.-India relations were unstable gave rivals an opening to attract the money, deals, and influence that might otherwise have flowed toward the partnership. The psychological impact of economic shockwaves cannot be underestimated. When businesses, investors, and governments lose faith in the stability of a relationship, they begin to prepare for worst-case scenarios. This preparation creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. Opportunities dry up, cooperation slows down, and growth targets are missed, not because they could not have been achieved, but because fear prevented bold decisions. The single act that triggered the crisis had now created a chain reaction of doubt, and in economics, doubt is as damaging as any official restriction. What makes economic shockwaves so powerful is their ability to outlast the original controversy. Even if diplomats manage to repair the political damage, the scars on economic confidence linger. Investors remember uncertainty, businesses remember lost opportunities, and policymakers remember the volatility. This long tail of economic consequences means that the cost of one mistake far exceeds the moment of its occurrence. The U.S. and India, two nations whose economic cooperation had been a symbol of progress and partnership, suddenly found themselves navigating an environment of hesitation and mistrust, where every decision carried the shadow of that single breaking point. Military cooperation under strain is one of the most visible signs that trust between two nations has been damaged, because defense partnerships are built on the highest levels of confidence, secrecy, and shared security interests. For the United States and India, years of effort had gone into creating a framework where both militaries could train together, share intelligence, and work side by side on global challenges. This progress was not easy. It required countless negotiations, agreements on sensitive technologies, and the political will to overcome suspicion rooted in decades of Cold War distance. When one mistake shattered trust, all of this began to look fragile, and the cracks in military cooperation became impossible to ignore. Defense is not like trade or culture, where cooperation can continue even in times of political strain. Military partnerships depend on reliability. The United States expects that its allies will honor agreements, respect confidentiality, and act with discipline. India, in turn, expects that the U.S. will treat it as a respected partner, not as a subordinate. When the relationship was tested by that single mistake, doubts began to rise on both sides about whether military cooperation could continue with the same depth and openness. Suspicion in defense is far more dangerous than suspicion in other fields because it involves life and death decisions, weapons systems, and strategic planning against common threats. Joint exercises, which had become a hallmark of U.S. India defense ties, suddenly carried tension. What was once a display of unity now felt uncertain, as questions about trust loomed in the background. American officers wondered if sensitive information could still be shared safely. Indian officers questioned whether the U.S. would reduce its willingness to cooperate or begin imposing conditions that undermined India's sovereignty. Even if the exercises went forward, the spirit of partnership was weakened. In defense, perception is as important as reality, and the perception of strain was enough to undermine confidence. Arms deals and defense contracts also felt the weight of this tension. India had been purchasing advanced American equipment, from aircraft to surveillance systems, while the U.S. saw India as a massive market and a partner that could help balance regional power dynamics. But the backlash from one mistake made American policymakers question whether providing India with cutting-edge technology was still safe. Could they be sure it would not be misused, leaked, or used in ways that contradicted U.S. interests? For India, the concern was different but equally serious. Could they trust that the U.S. would honor contracts and deliver systems without political strings attached? These doubts slowed the momentum of defense trade, leaving billions of dollars in question. Intelligence sharing is another area where the strain became clear. The U.S. and India had worked hard to build channels of communication to fight terrorism, track regional threats, and prepare for emerging challenges in the Indo-Pacific. This level of cooperation required extraordinary trust, because intelligence is one of the most closely guarded assets of any nation. After the incident, American officials grew cautious, fearing that sensitive information might no longer be handled with the discipline required. Indian officials, aware of this suspicion, bristled at the implication that they were unreliable. The result was a chilling effect, where information flow slowed and the effectiveness of cooperation diminished. Strategic planning at the regional level also became more complicated. Both nations had been aligning their strategies in the Indo-Pacific, working with other partners to counterbalance China's growing influence and to maintain freedom of navigation in critical sea lanes. A strong U.S.-India military relationship was central to this vision, but with strain introduced into the partnership, the reliability of India as a cornerstone of this strategy was questioned. If the U.S. doubted India's commitment, or if India felt pressured by American criticism, the entire regional balance could be affected. Other allies, such as Japan and Australia, watched closely, wondering whether the U.S. and India could maintain unity. Domestically, the strain created new political challenges. In the U.S., critics of closer ties with India used the mistake as evidence that Washington should be cautious about treating New Delhi as a trusted partner. In India, politicians skeptical of American intentions pointed to the backlash as proof that the U.S. could not be relied upon when sovereignty was at stake. These narratives hardened positions on both sides, making it more difficult for leaders to justify deeper military ties. What had once been a partnership based on optimism now carried the weight of suspicion and resentment. The human element within the military also reflected this tension. Trust between soldiers and officers, built over years of joint operations, depends heavily on the belief that both sides are committed to each other's success. When national-level trust is shaken, that belief weakens. American officers became more cautious in their dealings, and Indian officers grew more defensive about maintaining independence. Cooperation at the operational level slowed, not because of hostility, but because of hesitation. In military operations, hesitation is dangerous because it undermines the ability to act quickly and decisively when it matters most. What makes military cooperation under strain particularly dangerous is that its effects are not easily reversed. Once doubts are introduced into defense relationships, they linger long after political leaders declare that the crisis is over. Weapons contracts can be renegotiated, trade barriers can be lifted, and cultural ties can recover quickly, but military suspicion takes years to repair. The very foundation of U.S. India defense ties, which had been painstakingly built over decades, was now overshadowed by the realization that one act, one mistake, could place the entire structure at risk.